My name's Kody, and today I'm going to be talking about what it's like living with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness that involves hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, and psychosis. I actually learned a lot about schizophrenia early on in life. My mother was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. As a kid or a teenager, it was really confusing living with someone who was going through a psychotic break and not knowing what it was or not being able to put words to it. People around us thought she was either dangerous or on some sort of drugs. And so I usually had to help her just identify whether or not she was having hallucinations. It was really difficult navigating day-to-day life. School was hard enough, but then we didn't have someone who could caretake for us as, kids and young adults. And at no fault to hers, just circumstances meant that we had to really grow up quickly. And I was really fortunate that after high school, I was accepted into a college, but unfortunately, that's when I had my psychotic break. It started with me being paranoid that people were trying to put me away or lock me up in a psych ward. And then I started hearing voices, which at the time, because of my delusions, I thought was me gaining some sort of ability to hear people's thoughts. Apparently, it's really common for people with schizophrenia to have delusions early on that make them believe that they're not actually sick in any way. And so for me, it was believing that I was hearing the thoughts of people around me. And shortly after that, I started experiencing visual hallucinations, which have changed for me over the years. But early on, I would see faceless people and I would see what I call demons, is what they referred to themselves as. And so I would see more terrifying things. But after I was medicated and I was able to get treatment, my hallucinations shifted into seeing more regular people. So I always say that, if I'm in a room with three people and one of them's a hallucination, I won't be able to tell the difference. That's how real they are to me. I can't differentiate between who's really there and who's not. So I was in the library at my college. I was trying to get caught back up with all my schoolwork. After 10, 15 minutes of sitting there by myself, another student asked if they could sit with me. And so they sat down, they started asking me about my project. We got talking and we ended up having a really good conversation. And eventually the librarian came over and she was an older lady and she looked terrified. And she basically told me I had to leave. And it was at that point I asked why she wasn't asking the other student to leave. And I recognized that no one was there. And so I had been speaking to a hallucination for well over an hour. It was at that moment I looked around and identified that the librarian and the students were all watching me. And that was my first experience remembering having visual and auditory hallucinations. I will have auditory hallucinations by themselves where I'm hearing multiple voices or I'm hearing one or two voices, or even having so many auditory hallucinations that it sounds like I'm in a busy restaurant. And sometimes I'll have visual hallucinations that are not accompanied by any voice or by any auditory hallucination. But a majority of the time, what I personally experience is I end up having both auditory and visual, where I see the person and I can communicate with them, and they usually communicate back as well. A psychotic break happens when a person is developing a serious mental illness. In my case, I went from never experiencing any symptoms of this mental illness to being fully enveloped in the mental illness. And essentially that was my psychotic break, is no longer having control over my life. And that's what led to my addiction and eventually my incarceration as well. While I was experiencing hallucinations, I was using drugs as a way to self-medicate. And so I became addicted to anything that I could get my hands on. I was using drugs as a way to silence the voices, but also because my paranoia led me to believe that people were trying to put me in a psych ward or put me in a psychiatric facility. And so I would use drugs that would keep me awake for days at a time. So early on, when my hallucinations were darker and more terrifying, I basically secluded myself to the house because I was confused, but I was scared. What I was seeing didn't make sense, but it was so real to me that I couldn't really differentiate between what was going on and what I was perceiving. The difficult part about being delusional is things that should make sense don't, and vice versa. Whatever delusion you're having is going to be as real to you as everyone else living their everyday life. After a car accident I had, for almost a year after I was having a delusion that I was in a coma from the car accident that I was in, and everything happening around me was a part of a dream I was having in this coma. And so my auditory hallucinations would tell me that that's what was happening, and I believed it. That was 100% my real life. Is I was walking around believing that everything I was experiencing was just a dream happening in this coma. And the voices would tell me that the only way to get back to my real life would be to end this life. Auditory hallucinations can be different for each person. The important thing to recognize too is a lot of people assume that when I talk about voices, it's something I'm hearing in my head, and it's not. It's something I'm hearing next to me, down the hall, in the other room. Like, I'm registering it as noise. And so when I say I'm hearing these hallucinations, a lot of people confuse auditory hallucinations with intrusive thoughts or inner monologue, and that's not the same thing. Also, it's important to note that auditory hallucinations aren't always voices. A lot of people who experience schizophrenia hear sounds, noises, animals barking, sirens going off. There are a lot of different things you can hear, not just specifically voices. That's just been more my experience with auditory hallucinations. I wasn't properly diagnosed until after I was released from my incarceration. It was while I was in jail that I recognized that something was wrong, because I didn't have the distractions I had on the outside. I didn't have my phone. I didn't have my TV shows. I didn't have drugs. I didn't have any of the distractions. And it was during that time that I recognized that something was wrong with me and I needed to get help. Unfortunately, it's not easy to do in the American jail and prison system. So it wasn't until after I was released that I was able to meet with a psychiatrist and get a formal diagnosis of undifferentiated schizophrenia. It's no longer a diagnosis. The actual diagnosis now is a schizophrenia spectrum, whereas when I was diagnosed, it was different types of schizophrenia. After I was diagnosed, I communicated that with people in my immediate life, so friends, family. I told my mom first. Her reaction was pretty much, "Yeah, we were aware," and so that was the reaction of a lot of people I told, because I was delusional and I didn't think anything was wrong with me. But people saw me talking to myself, talking to people who weren't there. I would get terrified, I would get scared. And so all of these things that I was doing, I don't remember, but people told me they would like try to talk to me and it'd be like incoherent when I would speak back. The unfortunate thing about schizophrenia, and the reason why so many people go unmedicated and untreated, is you have delusions which cause you to believe that there's nothing wrong with you. And so even though I started to identify that something wasn't right, it took a while for me to be able to have clarity and realize that it was the same thing my mom struggled with. It wasn't even until after I was diagnosed that I finally accepted that that diagnosis was correct. The early steps to treatment were definitely the hardest, because, like I said, at the time, I didn't recognize that I was ill in any way. I didn't believe that I was struggling with schizophrenia. And so back and forth with care teams like my psychiatrist and my doctor trying to get me medicated, while me essentially resisting. Even though I went in and I asked for help, I was resisting treatment because I was confused and scared. And up until this point, still didn't really think anything was wrong with me. It was really concerning when I did receive the diagnosis, because I had seen the stigma around how people reacted when my mom was diagnosed. I had seen people that we had been friends with and family members just leave her life because they were scared or didn't understand the illness or diagnosis. And so when I finally received the diagnosis, my first thought was, this is the end of my life. This ruined my entire life. I'll never be able to do anything ever again. Later on, I identified my diagnosis as my life-saving moment. It was the moment that I was able to get treatment and medication. And had it not been for my diagnosis, I don't think I would be doing what I am today. I honestly don't know if I'd still be alive. I was very fortunate that antipsychotic medication did work really, really well for me. And I started having symptom relief within the first couple of weeks of taking my medication. And although my symptoms haven't gone away completely, the intensity, the duration, and just the darkness of my hallucinations shifted dramatically because of medication and being able to get counseling and being able to receive other treatment based on what my care provider thought was best. The treatment process for schizophrenia isn't like an overnight cure. It was several years of medication and treatment and hospitalizations. And so it was a lot of rebuilding my life and taking back what schizophrenia took from me. Living with schizophrenia and being more aware of it, that means I've had to find coping mechanisms for identifying hallucinations in my everyday life. One of which is using my phone camera to see if the hallucination is really there or not. So if I'm having a conversation with someone and I have like a moment of clarity where I think this person may be a hallucination, I'll actually pull out my phone, open up the camera. And if I don't see that person in my camera, I know they're not there. I've posted those videos online as well. So anytime I use my phone and someone isn't there, I take those videos and I post them so people can see what it's like for me to not only live with schizophrenia, but find coping mechanisms for my schizophrenia and for identifying hallucinations. And unfortunately, I have recorded people who are really there thinking they were hallucinations. I don't post those videos though, because I don't want to invade anyone's privacy. I do have a dog who is specifically trained to help me identify hallucinations and prevent self-harm. I will ask her to greet people if I think that they may not be there. And so if I ask her to greet someone and they're not there, instead of going up and greeting them, Luna will sit down and look up at me. And that's how I know that I am having a hallucination. She also helps prevent self-harm because sometimes when I'm having auditory hallucinations, I have a tendency to hit myself in the head to try to make them go away. So I have permanent scarring on my face from trying to hit myself in the ear or the head. It's an involuntary thing I do when I start having auditory hallucinations. Luna is trained to jump up either on my lap or try to get my attention and ground me. If I'm sitting down, she tends to jump up in my lap and put her face on my face so that I don't hit myself. You forget how much dogs are able to do, and there are times where I do believe that she is identifying that I'm having hallucinations well before I identify it. A lot of people, when they see videos of me using my phone or using my schizophrenia service dog to acknowledge whether or not people are there, they think that those coping mechanisms help me get rid of the hallucinations. And all it does actually is help me identify that I am having hallucinations. And then I usually still will have hallucinations for a certain amount of time after that, whether it's 10 minutes or 2 hours or 10 hours. It really just depends on, once again, how stressed I am, what kind of mental state I am, what else I have going on in my life. It's terrifying to not be able to trust your own brain. And I've gotten over a lot of the fear of my hallucinations because of medication. I'm not directly afraid of what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing. I'm afraid that my brain is able to do that and I'm not able to control it. So there's a constant level of anxiety and fear just about not knowing what's real or not, which is why I've tried to adapt to these coping mechanisms over time. How I react to symptoms, I think, is hard for people to see because it's not how I act in my everyday life. People forget that even though I'm functional most days, if I start having symptoms and I become afraid or confused, my reaction is usually pretty visceral. It's pretty obvious that I'm having symptoms. I tend to seclude myself. There's been a lot of times where I will have breakdowns in public where I recognize I'm having hallucinations and it'll bring me to tears or it'll get me so anxious that I have a meltdown in the middle of public. And so living day to day with schizophrenia is really challenging because I have symptoms in public. It makes me not want to go out and do things. And I find myself constantly having to power through that so that I can continue doing advocacy and working and being able to do motivational speaking. But traveling in general can be really stressful for me, and sometimes high stress can lead to more symptoms. My day-to-day life has become fairly comfortable for a person living with schizophrenia. It always revolves around my medication, so I do have to wake up and take medication immediately, but then I kind of go on with my life like everyone else. So I work, I travel for speaking events, I do social media, And so I'm really fortunate that because of medication, most days I'm functional. A lot of people who know me, if I didn't tell them I had schizophrenia, they would have no idea. The reason I tell people in my everyday life is because when I do start having symptoms, I don't want it to be a shocker. I don't want people to be confused. Obviously, day-to-day changes. If I start having symptoms, I have to call into work. I have to cancel events. I have to stay home. I can't drive if I'm having symptoms. And so my everyday life is still affected by schizophrenia, but I'm able to live a functional day-to-day with medication and treatment. There were definitely a lot of times pre and post medication where I thought that the easier solution would just be to not exist anymore. I'm very fortunate that I have an amazing support team with my mom, my wife, my care team, my psychiatrist. I've been always able to get the help I need when I need it. And that has been the reason that I function day to day, but also the reason I'm still alive. In terms of hobbies, I love video games. I walk my dogs. I love hiking. I'm at a really interesting point in my life where I never thought I would make it this far because of my illness. I never thought I would have all the opportunities I have now. And so I'm trying to experience new things as well. I want to go do things I've never done before, but I always try to focus on having time for my hobbies like video games and spending time with friends and family. I'm a very extroverted person, and so just being able to be out doing things day to day is one of the things that keeps me going in life. When I was first diagnosed, I made a really big deal about getting back to being able to be social, because it does cause you to become more secluded. You're less likely to go out and see people because you're afraid. You don't understand every interaction that's going on. It can create this safety of only being home. And I was really afraid of not being able to regain what schizophrenia took from me, which was my super outgoing, extroverted personality. And so even with medication, we've worked really closely with my psychiatrist to make sure that the medication I'm taking doesn't affect me being able to still be who I am. Communicating and working closely with your care team means that you can get symptom relief, but still be functional day to day too. There are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about schizophrenia. The first being that people with schizophrenia can't live like fully functional lives. A lot of people who start treatment with medication are able to live a day-to-day life and even work and thrive living with schizophrenia. The most recent studies show that 1 out of 300 people live with schizophrenia. So it's more common than people think. You've met someone in your life with schizophrenia. Not everyone is as open and honest about it as I am, because there is still a huge stigma around schizophrenia, which brings me to the second misconception. A lot of people still think that individuals with schizophrenia are inherently dangerous. Studies have actually proved that people with schizophrenia are way more likely to be the victim of violent crimes than to commit violent crimes. And so this is something I hear a lot, is people wonder how I go to work and go to school and function day to day. And the reality of it is, if I start having hallucinations, worst case scenario, I'm scared, I'm confused. And usually that just means that I need to either go home early or get myself out of a public situation. And the last misconception is that a lot of people still confuse schizophrenia with what used to be known as multiple personality disorder, which is now known as DID, or dissociative identity disorder. And a lot of people still confuse the two of them, and they think that people with schizophrenia have multiple alters that they're living with, and that's actually a completely different illness. I have a lot of people that will mention in my comments that maybe my schizophrenia is some sort of gift from God, or ability to see into another dimension, or ability to speak to some sort of other beings. And I absolutely understand people are allowed to have their own beliefs, but I want to express how dangerous that can be to say to someone with schizophrenia, because delusions can be life encompassing. So if someone's delusions latches on to the idea, example, religious delusions are actually the most common type, people believing they are God or they are speaking to God. That can be extremely dangerous for people living with schizophrenia. And I tried to shut that down on my page because not only can it be dangerous to me, but with over 1 million followers, I know that there are a lot of people that follow me living with psychosis or schizophrenia. And so those type of topics can be extremely dangerous and a really big misconception. I have a lot of different goals for my future. A lot of what I want to do revolves around advocacy now. I want to help people better understand schizophrenia and mental illness in general. I have a goal to speak in all 50 states for conferences. I have a goal to reach 100,000 followers on YouTube. I have a goal to not only be able to do my advocacy, but still either keep a full or part-time job. The reason I share my story is because when I was first diagnosed and I finally came to terms that, this was something I was living with and that schizophrenia was my diagnosis, I had a hard time because there was no one I could turn to. I love my mom, but she did not get a diagnosis very early, and so she isn't in the best place to advocate or talk about her struggles with the illness. I kept looking for people to learn from, and so my hope is that people with schizophrenia find my page, recognize that your life can get past this illness, this diagnosis. If I had to get one message across to someone living with schizophrenia or who was recently diagnosed, my message would be not to give up, because schizophrenia isn't a death sentence. It's not the end of your life. I know the diagnosis is scary, and I know that no one wants to take medication every single day, but be willing to work with your care provider, be willing to work with your psychiatrist, because if you don't get the treatment you need, it can be really detrimental for people with schizophrenia to not get treatment. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to share my story with you. If you want to follow my journey, please check out the links down below.